Nightcrawler is, without a doubt, my favorite movie. Every time I start talking about it, I realize something new, which makes me appreciate it even more than I did before. A lot of this comes from the great writing and acting, but even the technical aspects of the film are masterfully handled. It's developed a pretty big fan base over recent years, but I still don't think it really gets the praise and attention that it deserves. Most people feel that, yeah, it's a great movie, but they move on without really soaking in how great of a movie it is. Hopefully this video does it some justice, but I feel like even this extensive review will leave out certain things that I'm gonna think about later and wish I'd put in here. This is a spoiler review, so if you would like to go into the movie blind, which I strongly suggest you do, maybe save this video for later. I think the writing of Nightcrawler is definitely the standout. Every character walks this perfect line of sickening realism. Every character reads like someone you would never want to meet in reality, but they never feel like they don't exist in reality. Lou Bloom is obviously the focal point of the story, and his character is perfect. From the very first scene, you understand that this is a man who will stop at nothing to get what he wants. I've heard some people say they empathize with him, as he seems like he's down on his luck and maybe becomes a monster due to his surrounding environment. For me, the first scene alone establishes him as someone who has no thought or care for the people around him. They're pawns on his chessboard. His attitude and behavior are reminiscent of someone like Daniel Plainview, and they even have very similar statements in their opinions of humanity.
There are times when I look at people and I see nothing worth liking.
What if my problem wasn't that I don't understand people, but that I don't like them?
There's a very clear commentary in the film on the state of television news media and the people who enable its success, but Lou's character is a lot more than that. He's the picture of the perfect CEO. He's someone that has the necessary drive to achieve any goal that he puts his mind to, but he also lacks any human empathy that might hinder him in that pursuit. Throughout the movie, he gives line after line that you might hear from an out-of-touch boss who seems like they might not really understand what being a human is. Even his flirtation comes off as like a sleazy infomercial salesman. There are several points in the film where subtext is completely thrown to the wind and Lou just outright states what he's thinking. This is usually not a good practice in screenwriting because it treats the audience like children or like they're incapable of understanding the nuances of a character. But if you combine it with the rising tensions of the crime scenes or a business negotiation, Lou simply stating outright that he doesn't care about someone's well-being or someone's personal reputation is a lot more terrifying than anything fictional, because deep down we've all known someone like him. Some of the greatest scenes in the film come from Lou's interactions with Nina, the news director. Nina starts the film with an attitude suggesting that she's in charge and she knows it. She knows exactly how sick she is and she's comfortable with it. The idea that someone could be more comfortable with graphic violence, destruction, tragedy, etc. is beyond her imagination, which is why Lou is able to shake her worldview so substantially. From their first interaction, Nina tries to mask the fact that she wants the most horrific footage possible, but Lou has no reservations about defining exactly the kind of imagery that she seeks. As their relationship progresses, Nina begins to understand exactly how sick of a person Bloom can be. I personally believe that the dinner scene is some of the best screenwriting in the past decade because Lou just continually outdoes himself in how disgusting, repulsive, and manipulative he can be. It's in this scene that Nina realizes what someone without a moral compass really looks like. And yet Nina cannot bring herself to admit that she herself has a kind of ethical code, which leads her to metamorphosize into Lou's perfect mate. Almost like Harley Quinn to Bloom's Joker. By the end of the film, the two of them have what's almost a fetishization of tragedy. There's this sensual undertone to all of their interactions, and Nina gets borderline aroused from watching Lou completely abandon all ethical guidelines as she realizes that he embodies what she truly wishes to be. And then there's Rick. Rick is the grounding wire of the film. He's the one human character that the audience can latch onto in this sociopath circus. His response to the goings-on in the movie is exactly what any sane human being would be responding with. You can tell that he strives to understand exactly what Lou wants and really wants to succeed, but he slowly comes to realize that appealing to his humanity is pointless. As the film moves on, Rick becomes less and less surprised and more resigned to the fact that he's trapped working for a soulless criminal, which is something more than a few working class people can relate to. Even as he lays dying in the street, which is a consequence for daring to ask for equal pay, Lou sends him off with a lecture about company loyalty, as if murder is a completely justifiable response for disrupting his business proceedings. And you can see in Rick's eyes that he isn't even shocked by this. Even the minor characters in this film are written to perfection. Joe Loader manages to be even more detestable and obnoxious than Lou, despite the fact that he probably has more of a moral compass. The scrapyard manager, the pawn shop owner, and some of the news staff all come off as being people that you wouldn't really want to deal with, but are all visibly uncomfortable around Lou. The pacing of the film is immaculate. It makes 2 hours feel like 30 minutes. The film makes some of its slowest scenes into some of my favorites. Every sequence of events contains some fascinating element that carries you into the next. The Academy still shafted this film big time, but at least Gilroy got a nomination for the original screenplay because it was well deserved. While the screenplay is fantastic, the acting, I think, is what really ties everything together. Even the best dialogue can be diminished by an actor who isn't really fully committed to the part, and Nightcrawler doesn't have this problem. Jake Gyllenhaal is obviously the star of this film. He's been my favorite actor for a while, ever since I really started watching movies, and I don't think it's any debate that this is his best performance. There's not a lot that can be said that hasn't been said already, but I may as well talk about it while I have the chance because his performance is one of the main reasons I love this movie so much. It's clear that he had a lot of faith and investment in this project as he was one of the primary producers, and his performance is further evidence that he really wanted this film to succeed. Without even mentioning his drastic physical transformation, Gyllenhaal really morphs into a different person in this film. There are performances that are good where you forget that the person in the film is an actor for the length of the movie, and then there are performances that are so masterful where you feel as though the character could walk out of the screen and onto the streets, which are made especially effective when the character is a living nightmare. These are people like Daniel Plainview, Anton Chigurh, Heath Ledger's Joker, and Louis Bloom. Gyllenhaal's every line is delivered with decisive force, showing an unshakable commitment to every statement that he makes. There are little nuances to certain statements where there is a discernible elation to his voice when he manages to capture great footage of some horrible accident, or a distinct note of sadness when he has to report that something wasn't as tragic as he wished it was. As he becomes more and more confident in the movie, he pulls uncomfortably close to other characters, and it gives this feeling of claustrophobia. I think probably the most noticeable aspect of his performance is his eyes. A lot of acting training involves directing focus and eyeline, as the eyes are the window to the soul, and they go a long way to evoking emotion and intent. And nothing screams sociopath like his eyes. They're cold, unblinking, and they seem to swallow up anything they look at. Not to mention, Gyllenhaal gives one of the most effective displays of unbridled rage that's ever been caught on camera. I'm not the first to say this, but Jake Gyllenhaal not receiving even a nomination is one of the most criminal snubs the Academy's ever delivered. But as much as people talk about Jake Gyllenhaal's performance, everyone else in this film does a really great job. Rene Russo gives an incredibly nuanced performance of this stressed-out, overworked news director who's found her knight in shining armor. Every note of elation, disgust, and romantic attraction is pitched at this perfect level between believable and ridiculous. The vocal shifts of her tone as she bounces between being angry with Lou and being attracted to him is really haunting. Riz Ahmed plays a perfectly believable, clueless South Californian, which is even more comedic considering he's British. This is the first and only performance I've seen from him, and I'm really looking forward to watching other movies with him in it. Bill Paxton plays a giant douchebag where, as I mentioned earlier, he's somehow even more detestable than Lou, just based on his speech patterns. Everyone in this film just gives their heart and soul to the performance, and it shows. The cinematography of this film is pretty low-key, but it's just as immaculate as the rest of the movie. The director of photography for this film was Robert Elswit, who worked on There Will Be Blood and Punch Drunk Love. He has a style that's not particularly showy, but it's really, really effective. In the first act, I found the visuals to be relatively cut and dry. There's enough there to communicate the atmosphere and tone of a scene, but nothing that really sucked me in. But towards the end of the second act, the visuals become one of my favorite parts of the movie. I really like the shots of LA sprinkled throughout the film. It gives the city a life of its own and it makes it feel like more of a character than a location. One of my favorite techniques that is used quite frequently is the way the crime scenes are shot. Rather than filming the action directly, we see a lot of the goings-on through the viewfinders of the cameras. It makes it harder to tell what's occurring and it makes us put a little effort into our watching if we're to understand what's actually happening in the scene. Not only does it put us inside the mind of Lou, but it also makes us complicit in watching the tragedy. Obviously these tragedies are staged, but it's very meta in the sense of how we perceive what's going on in the movie because we are watching the accident exactly how news audiences in the film would be watching the action. There's also a lot of creative staging in this movie. When Lou and Nina are in the restaurant, the camera's close-ups become more and more extreme as Lou becomes closer and closer to cornering Nina into sleeping with him. When they negotiate pricing, Nina's stance becomes lower and less powerful as Lou gains more and more ground until he feels as though he's towering over her. When they're editing the final shootout, there's a shot that is hands down my favorite shot in a dark comedy. Lou and Nina are gushing over each other about how wonderful the footage, and they're shot at the same level to illustrate that they're perfectly in sync with each other, with Rick's face looking at them in the background. It's so disturbing that it's hilarious, and that's exactly what a dark comedy should aim to be. There are also a few shots that make the film nearly a horror movie. There's a shot of Lou's car in view of Loader's van, which immediately foreshadows the rest of the scene. Lou towering over Loader as he's pulled out of the mangled car. Lou staring directly into the security camera after he says,
"I like to say that if you're seeing me, you're having the worst day of your life."
Also, the scene where Lou shatters the mirror was completely unscripted to my understanding, and the way the mirror falls in such a way to really drive home how cracked Lou is one of those magical moments in cinema that you can't really prepare for. Overall, the visuals are really great, and I think a lesser director would have relied upon the screenplay in of itself and not really paid much attention to the presentation. I don't have a lot to say about the editing in this film because like the visuals, it's also relatively low-key. I do love some of the cutaways where our minds are left to piece together what happened, especially when Lou finds the nursery in the murder house. He flashes the camera into the crib, but we never actually see whether or not there was a child inside until the news footage, which adds further tension. There are a couple sequences where silence is adequately used, especially in the murder scene or the build-up to the shooting at the restaurant. I really enjoy the editing in the newsroom when they're piecing together the murder house sequence. It shows how fabricated the news can be and how people are literally in the background dictating what the newscaster should say, how to say it, when to say it, etc. There's also a great montage in the middle with upbeat music, like a news introduction, but it's juxtaposed with Lou saving footage under really horrific titles like Toddler Stabbed. It's another scene that works really well to drive home that dark comedy tone. Usually if people have any complaints about this movie, it's with the score. They say it really clashes with the tone of the film, how it's kind of floaty and ethereal, and it really contrasts with the dark nature of what's actually happening. On my first watch, I was initially a member of this camp, but everything makes more sense when you consider that the score is meant to be perceived from the perspective of Lou. There's a track that plays consistently every time Lou manages to take advantage of another window of opportunity, and once you imagine that it's music Lou hears in his head, it not only makes more sense, but it enhances the comedic elements of the film even further. There are bits of the score that are completely appropriate for the scene as well. There's a very haunting, intense song when Lou and Rick are following the murderers, and there's a few songs that have a very fast-paced, energetic tone. It's usually when they're driving to a location. One of my favorite songs plays over top of Rick's death, which makes the scene extra disturbing. The song has the tone of something that might play at the end of Fellowship of the Ring or Spider-Man 3 when a beloved character passes away, and the surrounding characters weep or offer their final words. Instead, we get Lou reprimanding him for daring to ask for a share of the reward, which clashes so heavily with the tone of the song, it's hilarious. Unrelated to the score, I really love the sound of Lou's car and the sound mixing of the car chase in general. You get that richness of the Dodge Challenger exhaust and the sounds of the police car sirens, but they never drown out the conversation in the car or the frantic dialogue over the police scanner. It's a small compliment, but lesser directors would have likely overlooked something like that, and what could be a really tense scene would end up being kind of a garbled mess. At its core, Nightcrawler is a brilliant dark comedy satirizing the mentality of many hardcore businessmen. The screenplay is a masterpiece, the acting is all Oscar-worthy, and it's supported by technical choices that leave the film feeling grounded and yet make you sick to your stomach at the same time, which I feel is the best thing a dark comedy can aim for. Let me know in the comments below if you feel like I missed anything great about the film, or maybe you disagree with something I mentioned, or feel that the film has flaws that I may not have touched on. I love this film with a passion, but I'm always interested to hear other people's movie opinions, even if I don't agree with them. If you enjoyed the video, please consider supporting the channel by liking, subscribing, or sharing the video with a friend. I really enjoyed making it, and I would like to have another one done by next week on another one of my favorite films.